Howdy, this is Mr. Justice. We're going to talk about photosynthesis. It's a two-step process, so we'll start with part one, the light reactions. By the end of today, you will hopefully be able to explain the roles of photosystems 2 and 1 in the light reactions of photosynthesis. You'll also hopefully be able to explain the reactants and products of the light reactions. Let's get started. So we're going to go through over some kind of foundational stuff here before we start to get into the light reactions. And so let's just talk about the differences between autotrophs and heterotrophs first. Autotrophs, it means to self-feed. These are the producers of our world. Examples include plants, algae, and cyanobacteria, which have pigments inside of them that can transform light energy into organic compounds, foods, right? They're able to make their own foods. Because of this, they form the base of the food web and provide all of the energy to all of the individuals within a food web. They have chloroplast organelles and also mitochondria. On the other end of the spectrum are heterotrophs. These are the consumers of the world. Examples include animals like us, fungi, and some bacteria. They're not able to make their own food, and so they consume this from other outside sources, right? Through eating, oftentimes, at least with humans. And then we break down those foods that we produce and then release that energy in those foods through our mitochondria, which produce a different type of chemical energy. And we'll talk about those types in a moment. All living things require energy to carry out life's processes. Energy is defined as the ability to do work, and the work done by living organisms includes breaking down molecules, building molecules, moving molecules into and out of cells. Also, reproduction requires energy, right? Cell division, mitosis and meiosis. Moving muscles, nerve cell functioning, sending a signal from your brain to your different muscles throughout your body that requires energy to do. Literally everything that a living thing must do to maintain homeostasis requires energy. Unlike matter, energy cannot be recycled, so organisms require a constant input of energy. Whether they're plants, that constant input of energy is the light that shines down that they're able to convert into foods for themselves. With heterotrophs, that constant input of energy comes from those sources of food that they consume. So all life runs on chemical energy, and the chemical energy that we deal with oftentimes in biology come in two simple forms: glucose and adenosine triphosphate, or ATP. We'll talk about these chemical energy molecules now. So let's discuss glucose. It has a chemical formula of C6H12O6. It's a sugar. It's a simple carbohydrate, and it is a way that plants can store chemical energy. We actually store glucose within our bodies as something called glycogen. It's stored within our livers, and it's usable to us when we start to break down that glycogen. It releases these individual glucose molecules that can flow through our blood, entering into our cells with the help of insulin. And I put this in here, the help of insulin, because it's an important concept here is that there are a lot of enzymes in our world, proteins, that help do jobs, that help the cells complete the work, right? As long as there's energy available, those enzymes can do jobs like help or allow glucose to enter into cells. Glucose is an end product of photosynthesis. It's what's made, and then it's ultimately metabolized or broken down during cellular respiration of mitochondria. Another form of chemical energy molecule that we'll have to deal with here is ATP. It stands for adenosine triphosphate. It's the energy-carrying molecule that cells use for energy. Some ATP is produced during photosynthesis to aid in the production of glucose. Your mitochondria, though, make a lot more of the ATP as it breaks down the glucose, but a little bit of it is made here in photosynthesis, and so we're talking about it as a result. Another chemical energy molecule that is used during photosynthesis is called NADPH. It looks like right here on the right-hand side, this molecule here on your screen. It stands for nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide phosphate, and it's an energy-carrying molecule that plants use during photosynthesis to aid in the production of glucose. So I mentioned prior that photosynthesis is a two-step process. And in step one, it's actually what we're doing is we're making these two energy-carrying molecules, NADPH and ATP, or we're charging them with energy so that the energy can then be used in part two to actually make the sugars, which we'll talk about part two later. Photosynthesis occurs in the chloroplasts of plant cells of green leaves. And take a look at this gorgeous electron micrograph of a real live chloroplast within a plant cell. Right, we can imagine that this is the inner and outer membrane of the organelle found within oftentimes the green leaves. And they're green because of that chlorophyll pigment. It's found within these structures here. You can kind of look at them. They actually look like pancakes, I think, of them as. They're called thylakoids. And stacks of pancakes, or stacks of thylakoids, I should say, together make up this structure here called the grana. This is, or granum if there's one, and if there's 1, 2, 3, 4, if there's more than one, then it's grana. So these are all the thylakoids here, and this is where chlorophyll is found. It's where the light reactions occur, right? So photosynthesis is a two-part process. The photo part, the light part, happens in the thylakoids. And the synthesis part, when we make the sugars, happens in all of the other area then of the chloroplast that isn't thylakoids. And this place is called the stroma. It's water, it's a lot of hydrogen protons, sure. There's also enzymes in there too that help to aid in the production of that sugar. Here's a simpler version of the chloroplast. Take a look, right? There's those thylakoids. Again, there stacks of them will we call them granum or grana, depending on how many there are. And in this area here, all of the other area that's not these thylakoids and grana are the stroma. And this is the location of second part of photosynthesis, or the Calvin cycle. All right, let's talk a little bit more about the chlorophyll. Remember, we're trying to build a foundation here for us to build on. So when we start talking about part one of the photosynthesis process, you'll understand some of the main players here, and chlorophyll is absolutely one of them. They're found in these pigments are found in thylakoid membranes within the chloroplast. It's a pigment that absorbs and is energized by wavelengths of light energy. And when they get energized, it actually helps an enzyme in the chloroplast to split H2O water, releasing electrons, the hydrogen, the H part of H2O, and oxygen gas. We'll talk about that in a minute. There's two types of chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B. Chlorophyll A is the main pigment found in plants, and it absorbs most colors but green. In fact, think about it. If it's absorbing reds and oranges and violets and blues, but reflecting back out the green, it's reflecting the green. So we see that these plants are green as a result, right? All right, so I mentioned before that photosynthesis is a two-step process. During step one, light will energize chlorophyll, and enzymes will use that energy to split water, H2O, into oxygen gas. And so it's this O2 gas that we're currently breathing in used to be water before a plant split it in two. And when it splits it in two, it releases the H plus ions. We'll talk about those importance in a minute. It releases the O2 gas as a byproduct that's free to leave and exit the leaves. And then some of the electrons from H2O become energized again by chlorophyll and get carried by that NADPH molecule here, along with some ATP. So we make some chemical energy in ATP and NADPH that will be used ultimately in the second part of photosynthesis. And that second part is called the Calvin cycle. This is when carbon dioxide is fixed into sugars. So take a look at this overview of photosynthesis. I would really suggest that you guys memorize this equation. And what I've done here is I have color-coded the equation for us, right? So that we can kind of account for where all of the H's, the O's, and the C's go on the left or the right of our equation here. So take a look. The water in this equation here is actually used in the light reactions. And when it's used in the light reactions, this is when the oxygen gas is produced. Likewise, in part 2, which we'll talk about later, the Calvin cycle, the carbon dioxide is fixed and used to create the glucose. So that carbon, right, the source of the carbon in glucose is the carbon in CO2, just as the source of these oxygen atoms in glucose comes ultimately from this carbon dioxide gas right here. Those oxygen atoms of water are what become ultimately the oxygen gas that we're currently breathing in. Take a look. These are the inputs of the light reactions. Light, water enter. They energize chlorophyll. Chlorophyll, along with enzymes, split water, releasing those electrons so that we can make some energy, right? We're also producing some ATP, NADPH. That will be used to fix carbon dioxide into sugars. These are the inputs of photosynthesis, and these are the outputs. So I keep mentioning that enzymes are responsible, proteins are responsible for doing some of the heavy lifting. As long as there's energy present in some form, these proteins, these enzymes, can do jobs. And the proteins or enzymes involved with photosynthesis actually exist within the thylakoid. So you kind of imagine where we are right now. This big glob right here is called photosystem 2. It's a pretty complex molecule. Here you're seeing a representation of it in the upper right-hand corner. Pretty complex. And chlorophyll is found within here, right? So chlorophyll gets energized, and when it gets energized, the enzyme is able to split water. And you can actually kind of see that happening here. H2O enters when there's the source of energy. Light energizes chlorophyll. It helps to split. It actually takes the electrons out of the H2O and passes them along into what will become called the electron transport chain. Meanwhile, as H2O is split, it's electrons taken from it, we produce O2 and some hydrogen ions, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So again, these proteins involved with photosynthesis, there's two of them that we need to know about. One of them is this one, the photosystem 2, which you can actually see down here in this image, photosystem 2. The other one that we should care about here is photosystem 1. And what photosystem 2 is essentially responsible for doing is making H2O, or let me say it again, splitting H2O into O2. It's producing a lot of H plus ions. It releases that electron. And it makes ultimately ATP. We'll talk about how in a moment. But yeah, those electrons from water are ultimately passed over to NADPH, which hold on to those high energy electrons. Along with the ATP will be used in step 2 of photosynthesis. So two important proteins here on this diagram are photosystem 2 and photosystem 1. Let's talk a little bit more about these. So photosystem 2 is actually the first of the embedded proteins to do some work here. So, you know, and then photosystem 1 comes second, and you might wonder, well, why is that possible? Well, photosystem 1 was discovered first, and so it was named photosystem 1 because of that. Photosystem 2 was discovered after photosystem 1, even though it comes first in our equation, if that makes sense. So take a look. Light energizes chlorophyll here, and chlorophyll absorbs that light energy. It becomes excited, and it allows photosystem 2 to split water into oxygen gas and hydrogen ions. The energized electrons then are passed along these other proteins along the thylakoid membrane, and they lose energy along the way because what they're doing actually is they're helping facilitate the transfer of more H plus ions into this inside of the thylakoid membrane. All right, and once all of that, as the electron moves down the electron transport chain, it actually gets re-energized by photosystem 1. More light energizes more chlorophyll within photosystem 1. which energizes the electrons and helps to attach them to this NADPH. So photosystem 1, the role that it has here is that it has chlorophyll in both of these photosystems, and what it does is it attaches high energy electrons to NADPH, and that chemical form of energy right here, NADPH, will be used in part 2 of photosynthesis. Now you might remember I mentioned that the hydrogen ions here are on the inside of the thylakoid membrane. In fact, some of these proteins here try to pump in those H plus protons. Plus we have additional H plus protons from the splitting of water. So what starts to happen, you can kind of think of this thylakoid membrane as a dam, like the Hoover Dam, for example. On one side of the Hoover Dam, we have a lot of water, and then I've got an electrical generator that the water will move through and create electricity from, right? As the water moves from an area of high pressure to an area of low pressure. Well, the same thing is happening more or less here in the thylakoids, all right? The thylakoid membrane is analogous to the Hoover Dam in that increase of H plus ions on the inside of the thylakoid is kind of like all of the water in Lake Mead. There's only one area in the thylakoid membrane that allows these hydrogen protons to pass through, and it's this structure right here. It's called ATP synthase. What ATP synthase does is synthesize ATP. It makes ATP, another form of chemical energy. So that large concentration gradient is created, and we have a higher electrical charge of H plus ions inside the thylakoids. They must move through ATP synthase. That movement of kinetic energy as the H plus ions move through is enough to power and create ATP, charging ATP so that it can be used later on in part 2 of our process. So let me just recap. What is photosystem 2? The photosystem 2 is responsible for splitting water, releasing electrons, and then producing ATP. If something were to happen to photosystem 2, you wouldn't make ATP. Photosystem 1 is responsible for producing and affixing those electrons from water to NADPH. NADPH and ATP will be used later on as the source of energy as we produce sugars, but that happens in part 2. So I've got this video here. I'm not going to play it here on our video lecture, but you can access this video by going to crjust.us/lightrxn. In fact, as you study and get ready for the exam, I would suggest that you guys have this link close by because you can revisit this video at any time. It's about 4 minutes long. And you can kind of watch it because it might do a little bit better job at showing you the animations and the movement of those electrons, especially as the electrons move down the electron transport chain as it produces ATP and NADPH. So I'd like you guys to include an answer to this FRQ within your notes. Create a T-chart, right? A T-table. One side could say the reactants or what is used in the light reactions, and on the other side of your T-chart you can have the products or what is made during the light reactions. And then I want you to put H2O, O2, NADP, NADPH, ATP, and ADP into one side of that table, all right, that T-chart. And we'll go over the answers next time I see you. I hope this was helpful.